Our next speaker got his undergraduate degree in architecture from Georgia Tech. Never got a graduate degree, but went back there anyway to teach in a master's program. He has built thousands of homes across metro Atlanta in price ranges from $100,000 to $400,000. He's been recognized for developments of excellence, and he is here to talk about the moral aspects of land use and property rights.
Thank you very much. So there are various ways to get experience. Certainly education is one of them, but sometimes the school of hard knocks is just as well. I guess since yesterday Aaron coined us the country club set of the Objectivist movement, that it's appropriate that we talk about human habitat, and specifically the morality of human habitat. History tells us that, frankly, we have been seeking habitat since probably the very beginning. There was a recognition of the human species that maybe we weren't so well adapted just to live our lives purely in nature. So we sought shelter. Sometimes there was some engineering involved with that shelter. Sometimes it was merely looking for the appropriate cave, but we have always sought shelter as part of the human experience. If we fast forward some number of years, today we have engineering marvels associated with that habitat. We live and work and play in these fancy buildings and glittering places, and you would think that the celebration takes place every day when we marvel at the accomplishments that we've made as a human species, but every camp doesn't necessarily see human habitat in that same way. There are folks that look at the competition that's taking place between humans and other species. And quite frankly, there are folks that believe maybe there is an immoral aspect of the human species pushing out other species. So why don't we take some time to talk about human habitat as it relates to morality. Well, morality, and to quote the man of the hour here, and you've seen certainly a lot of quotes, but we will use this to kick off our discussion. If we're going to talk about morality, we understand that morality has to do with choice, that we have to choose to be man. We have to choose to live as man. And as Galt says here, a code of values accepted by choice is a code of morality. And we build that morality from a foundation of life. Living organisms are really all that have that choice. We can exist or we cannot exist. So when we want to have our discussion on the morality of habitat, we begin from that base, a choice of habitat. And ultimately, we will want to sustain life. We want to have this in a moral context, not necessarily what's legal as it relates to utilizing land. This is, at its heart, a land use discussion. Now, it sure would be nice, as we've talked about all weekend, if this moral code was incorporated into the legal code. And so we will delve into that. But we will begin it by having a moral conversation about habitat. Well, what's habitat? You can go find these definitions in various places. And wherever you look for your definition of habitat, you're going to come across a couple of terms consistently. One is this environment where an organism lives, where a living organism thrives, a place that's natural for the life and growth of the organism. Not necessarily nature, but a place that is natural for the organism. So if we're going to talk about morality, we then have to at least acknowledge the nature of the organism. So where is this place that this organism can thrive? What is the nature of the organism? As Rand points out in the Objectivist Ethics, that our nature is not open to choice. We've got to investigate. We've got to discover the nature, and then with that nature, the organism is going to depend on the organism's life is going to depend on these two factors. We've got to have the material, we've got to have the fuel to live, and we've got to properly utilize that fuel. And clearly, habitat has something to say about that. With full credit to the Discovery Channel and their naked TV. If you're from my part of the country, that's naked TV. And clearly, no one would really debate that muddy water and brute force is, in fact, part of our nature, and that it's going to support this organism and this organism's life. Well, there are other places in the habitat that are a bit risky as well. Depending on your perspective, clearly we are not very well adapted. This organism, our teeth aren't very long, our claws aren't very sharp, we're not very well adapted to support life in this habitat. Now, if you have a different perspective of the cheetah, there's probably nothing wrong with a cheap lunch every now and then. And I certainly wouldn't even classify it as immoral to take advantage of a cheap lunch. But maybe we'll come back to that a little bit later. And size doesn't matter in this discussion of human habitat. There are very, very small organisms that we have difficulty dealing with. My own wife was hospitalized a few years back with an undetected tick bite. But notice that I had the opportunity to say she was hospitalized. We do, in fact, have something that's fairly sharp. It gives us a chance. It gives us the ability to survive in habitat, and that's our mind. That is our ability to use the human mind. And if we do that as it relates to habitat, we are beginning to combine morality with habitat. Now, the cheetah might wonder about this solution, but the humans sure would enjoy the habitat much better. So life and land. Life and land. That's the essence of our discussion today. Life of man is our standard. The nature drives the values. If we want to sustain life, we can choose not to, but if we want to sustain life, we need to seek out a habitat that provides the appropriate resources. So a moral habitat would support life according to the nature of the organism. So let's spend just a few minutes historically thinking about humans living on the land. Real quickly, and then we'll come back and fill in some details. We've always lived on the land, most of us. I presume most of you. I could ask for a show of hands of how many of you live on the land, and sometimes even ask how many of you live indoors. So we've always lived on the land. We've pursued those resources. For many, many years, generations, you would say, we roamed the earth looking for resources, nomadic villages. And frankly, as we came across those resources, and if someone else found them before us, we used brute force to take over those resources. So we roamed the earth. We could go where we needed to go. We utilized often brute force to take those resources. That turned into those societies that had more brute force than others. And we began to develop kingdoms and fiefdoms, still going on this morning around the world, where brute force is being utilized to acquire habitat for humanity. And then something changed here that in this country that we'll spend some more detail on, that the notion of private property came into play. And the notion of private property, not just for the king, not just a few fiefdoms, but many fiefdoms and it became property for many, and ultimately land then even became a commodity. So let's visit that in some more detail. There was some history associated with this. Not a lot, but certainly there was some history that we could go all the way back to John Locke and his discussion of natural rights that we see here. We fast forward to the formation of this country, and you could pick out any number of writings. I just happened to pick out the Virginia Declaration of Rights, and we find much discussion relative to life, liberty, and acquiring and possessing property, and an appropriate role of government to deliver and protect that right. But it is important that we grasp in this context, this was a philosophical movement. There was not history going back generations where we really understood the outcome of this process. What was the effect? We did deal philosophically with the cause, and again, as Rand pointed out in Man's Rights, the United States was the first moral society in history, in her view, and ultimately at the essence of that was property rights. Without property rights, no other rights are possible. This was a philosophical movement. This was not an economical movement. We had no real history economically what this was going to produce. Philosophically, it was the right thing to do according to the nature of humans. But there was a lot going on here, and it was happening very quickly. Over the first 100 years of the country, we went from a few colonies to basically the contiguous United States. The contiguous United States has about 2.2 billion acres of land. This chart you can't see very well, but in the second column, the point that I will make to you is that approximately 1.8 billion acres of land was added to the contiguous United States in these first 100 years. To the point there was a lot of land, and there was a lot of people, and there was a lot of constituency demand. There was a recognition that it was right to own property, and quite frankly was as much of a part of this experiment in freedom of people coming here as religious persecution and some of the other things that we study. So there was a lot of land. It was happening very fast. There wasn't a lot of history of how to do this, and there was a movement to divide it up. A lot of different ways to divide it up. But we had only about 20% of 2.2 billion acres of land. You ain't got to follow the math here, was never in the hands of some authority. So we were going through this process of divesting authoritative control of land into private property, and it was happening very quickly, and there wasn't a lot of history. There was always some relationship to public policy. Now that's important as we look through the context of our conversation, but what's more important is that we had to have a methodology. There was some common law that existed relative to fiefdoms loosely associated with fee ownership of land, had to do with the ability to will it. You could pass it down. But there was certainly no system, no methodology in place that said, how are we going to divide all this stuff up, and how will we create private property without some process to know uniquely where every piece of property is, and uniquely to define every piece of property. Ultimately, private property rights fail. If in fact I grow a tree and it's my tree, I can see the tree and I can put my arms around it, private property can be enforced. If in fact I go from the big rock over here to the big tree back there to the pine tree over here and come back across the creek, unless I can get some clear definition and understanding of which rock it is, which big tree it is, which creek it is, and uniquely define that property on the face of the earth, property rights fail. So during this quick movement, during this divestiture of land, we were also developing this system of fee simple land ownership. defining land, and perfecting this idea of absolute ownership. You can use it, you can possess it, you can waste it, you can dispose it, you can take its fruit, you can buy it, you can sell it, you can trade it, you can lease it. So land now is becoming a commodity. We have moved through private property rights to the idea that land is a commodity. But there are no guarantees to which land and to what you'll get from it. You can drown on it, you can get eaten on it, you can die on it, you can make some ridiculous decisions about the land that you choose, but it's your land, uniquely defined. With that process, we can put land into capitalism. Without that process, it was going to be difficult. With that process, we interjected land into this social system of capitalism that, again, Rand points out to us here in What is Capitalism? That social system based on individual rights, including property rights. You can see it, the only system that is consonant with man's rational nature as man. So here we are back. Here we are back with land and the nature of the organism. And we have put land into a social system that recognizes the nature of the organism, and effects start coming into play. You will make a reasonable choice when you choose your land if you can. Now, you might not get to choose paradise. If you can, you will. If you choose it and if you possess it, you'll take care of it. With the sharpness of the human mind, you will project out what you will need not just today, tomorrow, and next week, and maybe next year. If you are so unfortunate to end up with only Las Vegas, you will get very creative. You might even figure out how to dam up one little creek or river that's there and store some water. Most God-forsaken place on the side of the earth. There was a couple of economic attractions early on in Las Vegas that maybe had to do, Jerry, with your earlier talk with sexuality, but that attracted people. But there wasn't much natural resources. There was no real reason to go there, and somebody decided to build Lake Mead. Now, if any of you have followed it recently, they didn't put the straw quite low enough. Las Vegas got a lot more attracted than they thought. They put the straw in the water. They've been pulling water, but now it's getting too low, and they're having to lower the straw, but it's still a fairly creative solution. So not only do you take care of your property, creative self-interest kicks in. You start to figure out ways to even take a barren piece of property and make some human habitat out of it. But we have to differentiate when we go back to the philosophical movement between cause and effect. The cause is man's right to pursue his own good, a social system that recognizes the rights and private property as the essence. There are some great effects that have come from that movement. Creative self-interest in creating Las Vegas, taking care of the resources that you've got, best allocation of resources when we're using the sharpness of our mind, and abundance. We've gotten a lot from this system, but we put this in the context that is not, the effects are not the morality of the system. That's not what makes it moral. Quite frankly, again, if we look at the history, we didn't know that these things were going to happen with certainty. We knew it was right. The effect of it being moral made it work. So this philosophy of land, man is in fact an organism of the earth. We look at the nature of the organism. We deal with inalienable rights. We free up based on these individual rights. Rational self-interest kicks in. We are responsible for the land. We use reason with that, and government is instituted to protect those property, and it's worked. It's worked in a lot of different ways, hasn't it? Many of you might have looked at an economic study of a relationship with cows and elephants. Have you been worried much lately about extinction with cows? But we consume millions of them every year. But every day you read a hand-wringing article about elephants being extinct. Maybe there's many differences here, but there is one unique difference. Certainly here and in many places in the world, cows have been privately owned almost exclusively. They are private property, and if in fact you eat cows you would like to eat next year and the year after and the year after, and you take care of them that way. If you make your living from cows, you'd like to make a living next year and so forth, and you take care of them. If in fact you're consuming, if there's demand for ivory and you're consuming elephants and you don't own them, you consume all you can as quickly as you can because you don't know that you're ever going to be able to consume again. Well, interestingly, now there are some property rights discussions and implementations in certain parts of Africa relative to elephants. Just like happened in the Andes Mountains with the vicuna project some of you might have followed. Vicunas were an important part of the villages. I'm not suggesting to you that Peru, Bolivia, and Argentina are bastions of capitalism, but if you follow this, and again, some of you would know more about this project than I, but if you follow it, the species very close to extinction. The villages counted on the vicuna for their livelihood. They were being poached because of the value of vicuna wool and vicuna coats and so on and so forth. They implemented some pieces of property rights with the villagers having the rights to shear, process, and sell the wool, and they begin to protect the vicuna and the population grows. So it works. It has worked with human habitat as well. The morality of the system has produced in this country an incredible system of human habitat. I'm not suggesting to you that the shack is not a step up from living outdoors. Pretty good movement. But clearly, in 2, maybe 3 generations, this system of freedom, maybe not as free as some of us would like, introducing land and habitat to capitalism, has created the best housed society in history. 65% of the households in this country own their own home, moves around a little bit with percentages. Greatest source of wealth, but that's an effect. What it has done is taken the nature of the organism and introduced that to habitat and has produced housing, privately produced housing, that is privately bought and sold, that is privately traded, and the vast majority of our population lives in exquisite housing. And this has happened in a very interesting time. If we look at this population graph, and if we just look from about 1950, 50 to 60 years, the population in this country has doubled. Well, something else happened in this country that was extremely important to habitat over this same period. After World War II, our economy was still a majority agrarian economy. Coming out of the industrial age, still we were an agrarian economy. So while our population doubled, our economy became one of service. So no longer did families and individuals need 40 acres and a mule to make a living. They needed 40 square feet and a cubicle to make a living. And we saw this mass exodus to metropolitan areas. 75% of the population in this country today lives on about 4% of the land mass. So we have concentrated people doubled the population, and during that time, we have still housed people exquisitely. There are many places, as people are concentrated, that the living standards go down. I'm not suggesting to you that all of you would choose to live in the suburban environment that I show you here. But I would suggest to you that those thousands of homes that are concentrated in that private development, some public policy relationships there, but a private development. This is private property. They are privately owned homes. Probably 70% of all of those people wake up every morning at about the same time. And they do about the same thing that you do every morning when you wake up first thing. They will maybe take a drink of water first, and they all do it at the same time, and it all comes out clean. And then they get rid of some water, all about the same time. And it all goes away in about 5 seconds, and they never think about it again. They all have unfettered access with their personal transportation device to a docking station inside their house, a garage. They drive their car right inside the house. They don't have to ask Billy Goat Gruff if they can cross the bridge, unless you have a homeowners association. They don't have to ask. They park their car. They go into this controlled environment. We have 316 million people or so in this country. I won't even put a percentage on it. I'll let you think about this. 365 days a year, most of us live in an environment that never varies more than 10 degrees. We live between 70 and 80 degrees no matter what. We have, as Wart said, we have mastered nature, as creators do, and adapted habitat to this organism. And it's not just the walls around the house. Go to Heritage, take a look at the chart of the amenities that are in the house. 99.9% of 120 million households in this country have a refrigerator. How many lives have been saved by our ability to store food? Well, you can go down the list. You've all got them. 60% of you have two VCRs or something like that. Go look at the list. But then let me point out to you that 60% of the households in this country have internet service. We didn't even have internet 20 years ago, 89, 90. It was the mid-90s when we started connecting the internet to houses. And in this 20-year period, you do the math, 70 million households now have internet service, 180 to 200 million people. And Al Gore had connected every one of them by himself. No. So we have seen this incredible habitat from capitalism, but there's turbulent water in some groups. Maybe this hasn't been, according to some philosophy, this celebration. Why isn't the parade happening? Well, we might trace some of the current discussion from several places, but a lot would say the first publication of Limits to Growth in the 70s was a start of a discussion. As we're going to see, this was a philosophical discussion as well. There was predictions from the Limits to Growth of unprecedented calamity and shortages, and at the centerpiece of the discussion was again humans. But humans were the problem. Humans were the problem to excess. And quickly we began to talk about it in this country, and in this simple little phrase in the Constitution that the courts had taken in interesting directions over the years: interstate commerce, and the right to regulate commerce between the states. We saw a proliferation in a fairly short period of time of federal controls on land. At the centerpiece to this movement, coming out of the limits to growth, this strange notion began to develop that man was something beyond nature. This organism was something else. What? Well, I don't know. Council on Environmental Quality in 1970 began to produce reports, and out of that we saw, again, this proliferation of legislation in the legal system. We're crossing over here. We use morality to create this initial legal system, capitalism and freedom. We're using philosophy now to create a new legal system. Clean Water Act, every stream's going to be fishable and swimmable. Endangered Species Act, balanced ecosystem. Clean Air Act, park your cars. Move forward with carbon footprint. Get rid of the air conditioning. Well, we're going to focus on one context here because it is critical to understand the philosophy, and that is a balanced ecosystem. And if nothing I say you take away from here, I want you to challenge this notion, because we had some history with the philosophy behind a balanced ecosystem. And it is the religious doctrine of original sin. Now, we're here and we spend the weekend talking about writings of Rand and various things. And she said so many times that she didn't want to be a prophet. That was not her goal. So much was inevitable. And it was very interesting when you go back and read the Anti-Industrial Revolution article and even that book. She was writing some of this as this new philosophy was happening. But there was history associated with how to master men with guilt and fear. So we see the quotes here. And now you're not being asked to even sacrifice for your fellow man. You're being asked to sacrifice for seaweed. Or Canby's dropwort. Here is an example that I'm sure you are all familiar with, and familiar with the value of Canby's dropwort. It's been on the endangered species list since 1986. And every year, you so graciously send part of your profits to Washington, D.C. so that you can fund every 5 years a review of every species that's listed in the Endangered Species Act. And in this case, in 2010, and please, if you would like to challenge it, go look at these reports on the status in 2010 of Canby's dropwort. Status of the species is unknown. We don't really have enough detail. We don't know if it's stable, increasing, or decreasing. But it's endangered. South Carolina Department of Natural Resources said very little data is available. And it goes on. In 2010, the Center for Biological Diversity asked Fish and Wildlife to list 404 southeastern species. It's down to 367. They recently listed the slender claw crawfish, that valuable species, and they list it because they study various sites and they didn't find it. So it is obviously endangered. Why? The value of not existing has to go back to the philosophical concept of there is some moral imperative to a balanced ecosystem. What Council on Environmental Quality called the quiet revolution, it's here. Private property is something we can't afford anymore. Land rights would be allocated by society, and then look at the crossover with this morality to the legal system. The courts should presume that any change in the natural ecosystem is adverse. So then we see what the terms we're dealing with today, and you hear them all: sustainability, net zero energy, climate change. That's a doozy. Every third world dictator that's part of the United Nations has understood the license to steal that comes with climate change, carbon footprint. So now man is asked to adjust. We're not adapting our environment. We're not adapting habitat to this organism. We now need to adjust, as Rand said, to the man-eating tigers, the mosquitoes, and so forth. So in this great technology that we have, we are now being asked to go back and pray to Zeus that maybe my toilet will flush, maybe my computer will load. I would suggest you are being asked to cower at the roots of Canby's drop wart. But again, to use a Rand quote, there is semi-plausible bait in this discussion. We do need clean water. We do need clean air. We need to get rid of waste. We need good habitat. But again, as you so correctly pointed out, these are technical problems. These are not political problems. And it is only by unleashing the creative mind of man that we're going to solve these, and frankly, we've done it. I won't run through a lot of statistics. 90% of the pollution that comes from the automobile in 1960 has been reduced. You can go down. You can take this glass right here and dip it in the water coming from sewer treatment plants from the vast majority of municipalities in this country today and drink it, and it will be cleaner than the water around most of the rest of the earth. Technology has delivered these things. American Community Survey in 2010 found that 314.6 of 316 million people in this country have access to full indoor plumbing. And again, the obscenity of thinking that scientific progress is aggression against nature, but this is a philosophy and we can't forget it. This is a new philosophy of land. Man is unnatural to the land. The notion that there is this moral imperative for an elusive equilibrium is at the heart of this new philosophy. Man is infinitely dispensable in this new philosophy, can be violated with impunity while nature is not to be touched, unless you're some other species than man. Any other species can clearly alter the ecosystem with impunity. But man's the butthead. If we adapt our habitat, somehow we're the problem. We have done something immoral in this new philosophy. And it's strange that as we dehumanize the humans in this new philosophy, we are outside of nature. We're not to study our origin. We're not to study our nature and produce habitat that supports the organism. This rush to give human qualities to the little beaver family, a peep inside the home of the beaver people. Little daddy beaver and mama beaver, little baby beavers. And of course they get sweet grass and tender leaflets to bring into the babies. They have scoured the stream bank that you would be locked up if you did in order to get the tender leaflets and the sweet grass. And this history of this system, guilt and fear as a human motivator, has been tried over and over, and it continues to work. It continues to work. That's why they come back to it. But there's got to be this moral imperative of a balanced ecosystem for this system to work. The house of cards begins to fall if, in fact, we banish it. So how should man live in this new system? if we're going to do anything other than lay under the trees, is it okay if we just use sticks and mud to build a hut? Is that okay? Is that the equilibrium? When does this equilibrium exist? If you want to start the discussion to banish it, the next time it comes up, just ask, well, when was that? Can you give me the date of the equilibrium? But wait a minute. The system of capitalism, we're still using sticks and mud, aren't we? That's still going on. And we're creating this exquisite habitat out of sticks and mud because our mind is sharp. We do have something sharp. But we've got to come back to the philosophy. We've got to advocate for man. We've got to advocate for humans as it relates to habitat. Back to a philosophical defense. Not the practical. I know it creates abundance. I know that we can take sticks and mud and do this. But it's a philosophical defense built on the very principles that we talked about earlier: individual rights, and right to property, the nature of the organism, a social system, and so on and so forth, the creative mind of man to, in fact, set man free from men. Because if we don't, we're sending a message, and it's great. Donahue and others were spending so much time this weekend talking about education. If we don't, we're leaving our children defenseless. As defenseless intellectually as they would be physically. As we teach them about the cuddly, warm polar bears, and we humanize these species, and we dehumanize our children with guilt, they would be as defenseless intellectually in this habitat as they would be physically in this habitat without the creative, ingenious, capitalistic mind of man. So I would suggest to you that that is at the heart of the morality of human habitat, that we banish the notion that there is a moral imperative for some unknowable, undefinable balance, and that humans are the only species that, in fact, can throw that balance off. Thank you, and I welcome your challenges and your questions.
If you have a question, please come up to the microphone, state your name, and ask your question in the form of a question, please.
We live in California where we've been in a perpetual drought now for the last few years, and we steal our water from, and I use the term steal our water from Colorado because I believe the landowners there that are having their water taken and sold would not agree that they're doing it willingly. I just wonder how, since so much of the land is not habitable without taking other resources from other people, how do you feel that there's a balance between justifying ruining his land so that I can have my toilet flush in San Diego?
Right. The notion that water or any natural resource is a finite, one-size pie, and the problems are only how to divide the pie up is as age-old in the argument as this balanced ecosystem. And that's where the notion comes in. That being said, there are an entirely different talk about water rights and legal water rights, and even the implementation, appropriate implementation of government programs to protect your property from me. Not to take my property to give you, but to protect your property from me. So when, in fact, we, again, branches into this legal discussion of water rights, ultimately, trade between human beings is the solution. Appropriate property rights, protected property rights, trade, ideally between individuals. Now, this takes us down an entirely different conversation of public infrastructure that I'm happy to talk to you, and we can go on and on. Was that an appropriate choice we made historically along the way for most infrastructure, water, roads, things of that nature, to be public versus private? That's a good debate to have. That's where we are. But ultimately still, doesn't change the nature of this organism, doesn't change the nature of property rights. It is a very legitimate discussion to have of how we do that. And if we put it quickly into the environmental movement, I'm from an area of the country that gets about 45 inches of rain a year. But water and running out of water is a big deal because we can't build reservoirs. Just to put it into the context that, we got plenty of water, it falls right out of the sky. We just can't hem it up anywhere because we will do something to the slender claw crawfish.
I'd like to play devil's advocate for a moment. I'm Alexander R. Cohen, by the way.
I would expect no less.
If I were standing here as a progressive, or probably even many mainstream Republicans or establishment Republicans, I might say, well, you say that all this clean air and clean water is a technical problem, and sure, a big part of the solution is creating the technology. But a lot of that technology has in fact been created, such a person would probably say, because the law required people to either use less and produce less, or use technology that allows them to do it more cleanly. So, could you talk a bit, please, about how those technological problems would be solved in a free market context without the incentives provided by such regulation?
I first would make and go back to the moral argument that none of this changes the nature of this organism and how property rights, again, would come downstream from that. Secondly, I would challenge the premise of the role of regulation in fact, cleaning up the water and the air and so on and so forth. Now, there is no question that regulation has, in fact, forced action. Has that action been efficient? Has that action been the best allocation of resources? And I could pick any number of examples, but I'll pick one that's easy. The regulation relative to building in floodplains. We implemented a flood insurance program through federal government because we had made choices along the way, logical as they were, to build next to streams, and they flooded. Flooded last year, flooded this year, it's going to flood next year. There was no way that private business could ensure that. We made a determination, we're not going to leave those people where they are. Maybe that was the problem. Should have let it private take care of itself, and it would have sought a certain level of role. I'm using this as trying to be a quick example. But we didn't. We began to subsidize building next to the water. And I'm very appreciative. I had a condo on the ocean for many years, and I'm very appreciative that all of you, again, sent your profits to Washington so I could have flood insurance with that. So while we are subsidizing a bad allocation of resources on the one hand, we regulate it on the other hand. So the notion that regulations have spurred, have in fact maybe in some cases accelerated policies, does not mean that it was in fact a best allocation of resources with that policy. You know, and you could pick CAFE standards with automobiles in a similar way. I mean, people have written, you know, various folks, Heritage and some of the others, that there is a pretty good bit of data of how many people have died because of plastic cars to meet CAFE standards. So just because policy pushed regulation forward or advanced it does not mean that the policy itself was in fact a valid policy. So that would be, but it's clearly at the heart of a lot of this debate, Andrew, and I'm appreciative.
Hunter Rojas, when you look at a lot of the issues where governments tend to come in and intervene and essentially kind of like, you know, create standards for clean air and clean water, you have an issue of negative externalities that aren't being assumed by the person creating them, like when, you know, factories would pollute and then it would create acid rain that would hit states and people miles and miles away, but at the same time realistically trying to create property rights for air and clouds and ownership becomes incredibly difficult and even hard to realistically enforce or define. How do you feel that, you know, a free market system could come up with a way for dealing with these externalities sort of before they occur, or kind of create like a mechanism?
I would first, the reason I use the point about fee simple land ownership here, over the course of 100 years, we devised a system and we divided up 2 billion acres of land and put the vast majority of it into private hands. I am fully convinced, had we left some of the environmental issues alone, we would have just as creative solutions relative to air rights as we do with water rights. Water rights are, again, we had enough free history with water rights, so they got somewhat defined. There are some issues. There's some policy issues between states where water comes, just as you pointed out, but there was a good bit of private history that allowed certain rights, water rights, environmental rights to be done. We never had that chance with air rights, for instance, in the example you bring. So do I know exactly how those air rights would have been divided? No, I don't. I don't, because we started with the regulatory environment. And so could it be done? Absolutely it could be done. It could be done through private insurance programs so that you could insure yourself against unforeseen environmental actions. And I think that, you know, actuarially, those systems could have been devised once we realized. Secondly, and the reason I bring up the notion of the balanced ecosystem, we have got to question true damage from some of these actions. Just like with zoning, we have gotten with zoning at a local level where there's no real discussion of what true damage is. It's just amazing as a developer how many, you know, rooms full of people will show up and say, to protect my property rights, I have got to take your property rights. Well, what's the damage? And we've gotten way into this esoteric discussion. You're going to build 1,600 feet, and I live in 1,700 feet. That's the damage. No, come on. So is there real damage? What is the real damage in the environment? And we have not given these environmental circumstances any way to balance out as to what the value is, any more than we know what the value of a slender claw crawfish is. What's the value of a slender claw crawfish? We haven't let these types of things hit a marketplace where they can be bought, sold, and traded, and that's the best way to determine value. What is it worth someone else, to someone else? That's what happened with land. We put it into capitalism, and then once we started buying, selling, and trading, we figured out that some places aren't as valuable as the other. I would suggest to you that environmental issues would work exactly the same way. The freer we get with them, we are going to find and see them seek a value and be able to determine the real value. Until then, you know what we've done? We have devalued the environment. There is no reason you should be able to freely walk outside and not pay to enjoy nature. And once you do that, what's it worth? It's worth nothing. It has got no value whatsoever because I'm entitled to that. Really? Really? No, I'm not entitled to that. And this system of government regulation has sucked all the value right out of the environment because it's free. It's free. It doesn't cost anything. And you can trade it. You can do it in money. I don't care what you trade with it. It doesn't cost anything. It's free and it's worthless. Something that's free is worthless. And that's what's happened with so many environmental issues.
Thank you.
Donahue, Shortridge, Littleton, Colorado. Majority of the land in the West is owned by the federal government. I don't know exact number. It's somewhere between 65 and 85%. You might know, Rick. What I was wondering is, when an individual gets in financial straits, we sell assets. Why can't we, or what could we do to provoke the federal government to sell some of this land to private individuals to A, pay off our debts, and B, have it become productive?
Right. Within this neo-philosophy of land, we can't, because there is built into this notion, there is an entitlement and there's a morality, again, my opinion, and there's a morality built into this. And as soon as the discussion hits the table of selling this valuable asset of fill in the blank, wilderness, forest, old growth forest that was new growth forest and will be old. This idea, it was old on June 2nd and that was our balance date. We can't get there in this philosophy because it has got as much legitimacy in the legal and the philosophical system today as a best allocation of resource does in your philosophy. But that philosophy doesn't exist, and we're not challenging it philosophically because that's ultimately the only way to get this best allocation of resources. But the reason I get, the question before, and I appreciate it, in saying until you put something to a group of people, you don't know what it's worth. I mean, that's the neat part of capitalism because it gives us a chance to value. We can vote. We can vote, and we vote with our valuables. Now, money's a pretty good medium, as Francisco explained to us, but it's a pretty good medium to do that with. You can do it with other things. But it is the best allocation of resources that ultimately is an effect of a free market system, and that doesn't exist in that debate. Well, thank you. I enjoyed being with you, and